She lies. She's worthless. A very low IQ person. The words ripped through the air like shrapnel. Another insult hurled into the crowd. One more in the endless catalog of verbal blows that had become Donald Trump's signature. But this time, it wasn't directed at a rival on the campaign trail or even at a foreign adversary. It was aimed at a sitting member of Congress, and that made it different, sharper, crueler, dripping with an irony that stung all the more because of what had come just moments before. Trump had been boasting again, grinning wide under the bright lights. "They tested me, folks. An IQ test. I scored an incredible 180, one of the highest scores you can possibly get." The crowd erupted. MAGA hats bounced in unison like a sea of crimson buoys. Flags whipped against the air. Cell phones shot up, capturing the moment for posterity. The cheers were so loud, so fevered, it was as though Einstein himself had risen from the grave and walked into the arena. And Trump basked in it, arms spread wide, chest thrust forward, wearing the invisible crown of genius he'd crowned himself with. But beyond the echo chamber of that arena, the reaction looked very different. Newsrooms went silent. Journalists froze mid-keystroke, staring at their screens. "IQ of 180? Someone muttered aloud. Doctors and psychologists rewatched the clip, brows furrowing deeper with each replay. Numbers like that aren't just rare, they're practically mythical. If true, where was the proof? Where were the records? Fact-checkers swarmed. Google searches spiked. Curiosity turned into skepticism. And then, in the shadows of Washington, one freshman congresswoman quietly decided to take it further than anyone else. Her name was Jasmine Crockett. Unlike most critics, Crockett didn't waste time on clever retorts or viral memes. She didn't want headlines. She wanted evidence. And so, with a calm patience that few in her position could afford, she began gathering whispers. A stray comment from a staffer here, an overheard story there. She stitched fragments together, bit by bit, until the outline of something real began to take shape. Months passed, and then, finally, the pieces snapped into place. A folder landed in her hands, leather-bound, heavy, undeniable. Inside, the very test Trump had so often bragged about. The test that, according to him, proved his brilliance beyond question. Except, it didn't. And Crockett knew this revelation couldn't simply be tossed online like gossip. It needed weight. It needed a stage. So she chose one. A congressional hearing, televised, formal. The kind of session where silence itself feels like a character in the room, pressing down on everyone's chest. When Crockett walked in, folder tucked under her arm like a loaded weapon, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Reporters straightened in their chairs, pens hovering, cameras locked onto her, tracking her every step. She didn't rush. She didn't smirk. She carried herself like someone who already knew the ending to the story the rest of the country was only just beginning to read. She sat. She waited. She let the tension spool out until the room vibrated with anticipation. And then, when her moment came, she opened the folder. Slowly, precisely. No theatrics, no unnecessary flourish. Just deliberate movement, the kind that makes people lean in without realizing they're holding their breath. She began to read, and what spilled into that chamber was not the story Trump had been selling. It wasn't an IQ test, not a battery of logic puzzles, not the Stanford Binet, not the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. It was something far more ordinary, something far less glamorous. The Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the MOCA. Not a measure of brilliance, not even a test of intelligence. Just a basic screening tool used by doctors to catch the earliest signs of mild cognitive decline. Its questions are almost childlike in simplicity. Identify familiar animals. Repeat 5 words after a short delay. Draw a clock. And this was the exam Donald Trump had wielded like a golden scepter, the flimsy foundation for one of the boldest claims of genius in American political history. Crockett's voice didn't waver as she read on. The answers themselves told the story. Shown a simple drawing of a penguin, Trump had scrawled 2 words: snow chicken. The phrase hung in the air like an off-key note. At first, the hearing room didn't know whether to laugh or gasp. Eyes darted, brows furrowed. Did he really write that? Did he mean it? A ripple of uneasy murmurs spread. Then came the next image. A rhinoceros. Trump's confident response? Unicorn with skin problems. This time, the tension cracked. Suppressed chuckles leaked from the corners of the chamber, swelling into awkward laughter that no gavel could smother. But Crockett didn't smile. She turned the page, her expression unflinching. The clock test. The most infamous part of the mocha. He had been asked to draw a clock showing 10 past 11. Instead, Trump had clustered nearly all the numbers on one side of the circle, the hands jutting aimlessly, pointing nowhere. In the margin, the attending physician had scribbled a note that tried, futilely, to sound clinical. Difficulty with spatial organization. Crockett read that line slowly, then closed the folder halfway. She didn't slam it. She didn't grandstand. She simply let the absurdity sink in, the silence growing heavier by the second. Finally, she raised her eyes and locked them on Trump's allies across the table. "This isn't about comedy," she said, her voice low, steady. "This is about deception." The laughter died instantly. A hush fell over the room, sharp and suffocating. "For years," Crockett continued, "Donald Trump has spun a myth about his health, his stamina, his brilliance. He's woven it into his brand, into his very identity. But a brand built on lies can only hold for so long, and when it breaks loudly." At that moment, the story shifted. It wasn't about a test anymore. It was about the illusion, the long-running performance, the perfect health claims, the best genes speech, the ghost-written letters from doctors, the vague boasts about the highest scores. It was never about IQ. It was about control, image control. And Jasmine Crockett had just torn a hole in the curtain. But she wasn't done. With a deliberate pause, she tilted her head and let a faint grin escape. Then she hinted, just hinted, that this folder wasn't the end. More documents, more contradictions, possibly even sworn testimony from a White House physician. She didn't need to say what was inside them. The suggestion alone was a spark, one that ignited newsrooms across the country. What if this was just the beginning? Chapter 1 had just closed, but what if it was only the opening act? What if the next folder held something darker, heavier, impossible to laugh off? Political war rooms erupted. Phones buzzed nonstop. Strategy memos flew across inboxes. Conservative pundits scrambled to contain the fallout, each scrambling for a lifeline. Some insisted the test had been misrepresented. Others leaned into denial, arguing that the MOCA really was an IQ test, just a simplified version. Within hours, Trump's defenders found themselves in the bizarre position of debating penguins and unicorns on live television. And Trump himself? He went nuclear. At 12:41 a.m., his familiar digital fury appeared on Truth Social. "Jasmine Crockett is a low IQ maniac." The words blazed across screens, dripping with rage. The irony, of course, was almost too rich. A man who once boasted of a 180 IQ, now reduced to calling a congresswoman low IQ after mistaking a penguin for poultry. Trump promised redemption. A new test, a better test, administered by, in his words, the best people. What that meant, no one knew. Would it be graded by Elon Musk? Scored by Kanye? Administered by Sean Hannity under studio lights? The internet didn't wait for clarification. The damage was done. Snow Chicken went viral. TikTok creators lip-synced Crockett's voice. Twitter feeds filled with doctored IQ tests, each one plastered with penguins. Late-night comedians barely had to lift a pen. Reality itself had already written the joke. But beneath the memes and hashtags, something more serious was stirring. Because it's easy to laugh, easy to mock, easy to turn Snow Chicken into a punchline. The harder truth was this. A man who had built his identity on being the strongest, the healthiest, the smartest, had been hiding behind a test that measured none of those things. A myth that millions believed, a myth that millions still believe. And that is why it mattered. Because politics isn't just about policy papers and speeches. It's about trust. And when trust is replaced by performance, when leadership becomes an illusion sold as strength, democracy itself begins to warp. So yes, maybe the penguin was funny. Maybe the unicorn was absurd. But what they represented was deadly serious. A leader willing to lie about his own mind to protect his image. And a system willing to let that lie thrive. If Chapter 1 was this surreal, what comes next? What's waiting in Chapter 2? Stay tuned and keep your eyes sharp. Snow chickens have a habit of showing up right before the truth lands hardest.